Cayman,
the voice,
the heart, the soul of the Cayman Islands.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you. We're a not-for-profit, member-centric plan with a democratically elected volunteer board of trustees representing all sectors of the Cayman Islands economy. Chamber Pension has an all-in expense ratio of 0.80%, over 16,000 members, and US $463.6 million in assets under management. We were the first multi-employer pension plan approved by the regulator in the late 1990s, and today we are still strong, secure, and are here for our employees and employers alike. If you would like to join or request further information, visit chamberpension.ky. And for information as it happens, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Email admin@pensions.ky or call 745-7630. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you.
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
Good morning and welcome to Money Sense. I'm your host, Amy Hubble, promoted by the CFA Society of the Cayman Islands, and we are joined in studio today by Andrew Miller, who's a partner at Bedell Kristen. Andrew specializes in all aspects of Cayman Islands and BVI international wealth structuring for individuals and financial institutions. He is the past chairman of STEP Cayman, a founding board member of STEP LATAM Conference, and the STEP Cayman International Wealth Structuring Forum. Andrew, welcome to Money Sense. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Amy. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So our topic today is death, right?
Essentially, yes, unfortunately.
Which sounds kind of crazy in terms of
expecting somebody else?
No.
Okay.
We're talking about death and specifically estate planning, which usually is an odd time of year to talk about it, right? Because we're supposed to be in December, we're supposed to be celebrating, it's supposed to be Christmas, we're supposed to be happy.
Yeah, we'll try and make it the sort of lighter side of death, if you like.
Yeah, I always kind of
find that the good side, the planning side.
When you get together with your family, it's a good time in December, a good time in Christmas to kind of talk about some of these things. But I also find that, and give me your perspective on this, that words like estate planning and probate, they're not very descriptive kind of what they're talking about or what it kind of refers to.
Yes, some of the language is quite archaic, quite technical, but essentially, if you were to describe it, it's the process whereby you ensure that your assets get administered by the right people and go to the right people. That's essentially what it's all about.
Yeah, and it's a legal process, right, in terms of what probate is.
Yeah, so under our succession law, and I'll try not to talk about the law in terms of the technicalities of it too much, but under our succession law, it's a requirement that somebody gets a grant of representation. They need to do that in order to deal with the assets of a deceased person. You can't sort of access monies in a bank account or sell a property or anything like that until you've got a grant of representation. And a grant of representation, that will either be a grant of probate, if there's a will, or a grant of letters of administration, if there isn't a will, or it may be if the person, for example, died overseas and they've got a grant of probate from an overseas court, then and they have assets in the Cayman Islands, then you can reseal that foreign grant.
So would somebody who dies overseas or who dies here and who is a citizen overseas, would they need to go through the probate process?
Essentially, if
somebody would need to go through the probate process.
If there are assets in the Cayman Islands, you will need a grant of representation of some sort.
Okay. And so assets in the Cayman Islands, what all could that include?
Yeah. Largely, you divide that into two types. What are called immovables, and as you would imagine, that's essentially land, and then movables. And movables include things like, of course, money in a bank account, or a very common one for people overseas, shares in a Cayman Islands company. And then immovables will always devolve in accordance with the succession laws of the Cayman Islands, whereas movables will devolve in accordance with the laws of the domicile of the person. So if, for example, you had someone from, say, France, then their movable estate will devolve in accordance with French law.
But they would probably still have a probate hearing
Yes.
in France as well as here.
Yeah. I mean, where you tend to see a resealing of a grant from overseas will be where the laws are very similar to Cayman Islands law. So if you're talking about English law or Australian law or New Zealand law, or most of the states in the US and most of the states in Canada.
Yeah, and I'm American, as most of our listeners hear quite often. But I know that in America, obviously, the probate process and the process of how your estate might be distributed under the law would be determined by the state you lived in. Is that common globally in terms of, or is it more of a country level when we're talking about English law? Or
yes, I mean there are international treaties on these things, but essentially, yes, it tends to be that someone's domicile will govern how their estate devolves.
So we assume somebody living in West Bay and somebody living in Savannah, that the law is going to be looking at those two people the same.
Exactly the same.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because I know you write a will. Most people kind of inherently know what a will means, kind of what they would say who would inherit what of what you own. But what if you die and you have not done a will? And I know you were telling me an example before we went on air too.
Yes, there are.
Where would it go?
There are what are called intestacy laws, and the way it works is that Cayman Islands law will determine, first of all, who is entitled to deal with the assets. So those will be the administrators.
So who would that usually be? If they're
yeah,
not
there's
named?
as you would imagine, there's a sort of chain of a succession starting with a spouse and then adult children, and working down the chain. So generally speaking, it'll be a surviving spouse or children. Leaving things to the vagaries of the intestacy laws is not generally to be recommended. I think that the slight risk is that people will say, well, my estate will go to my wife and children, and so, why do I need a will? Well, it may be that, for example, you might think about, right, okay, well, is my spouse or my adult children, are they the right people to be administering my estate? You need to think about, right, okay, well, do I want to make any gifts to charity, gifts of any family heirlooms, gifts of cash to, say, like a godchild or something like that? How do I want my estate to go? Do I actually really want it all to go to my wife, or do I want to give some of it to my children at this stage? It's a slightly morbid topic, but one needs to think about funeral wishes. Do I want to be cremated? And I think one that makes most people sit up and take notice is where there are minor children,
right,
and the appointment of guardians. I mean, in the nightmare scenario where both parents go down in a plane, you need to be thinking about, right, okay, well, who would be the right people to be looking after my children in those circumstances?
Right. And is that specified in a will, or is that another document?
Yes, it'd be in a will. So you usually specify who your executors will be, and generally speaking, it will be something like a surviving spouse, or if the spouse doesn't survive, it will be, quite often people will choose their, say, like brother and sister or something like that, or if there aren't any obvious choices, then you can appoint a lawyer to be your executor for you.
I assume you've played that role quite often in your life.
I've played that role a couple of times, yes.
Probably yesterday. Right. Well, what kind of assets, and in terms of, are there any assets that transfer without probate? And I know at least say, pension plans or life insurance policies?
Yeah, there are some assets that will pass outside of the estate. The classic being, yes, like a life insurance policy, there may be some sort of nomination of a beneficiary. Likewise, in terms of pensions, and also joint property. So commonly, say, the matrimonial home will be owned as between the husband and wife, and that then just devolves to the survivor as a matter of operation of law.
Right. So they wouldn't need to do anything necessarily in terms of...
I would still recommend having a will in any event.
Well, yes, of course. But in terms of filing any paperwork, if your spouse dies and
It's a much simpler process. Yes, it's just a sort of certified copy death certificate lodged with the land registry type of thing. Whereas an application for a grant is an application to court. There'll be the application document itself, supporting affidavit, certified copy of a death certificate or original death certificate. And then, depending on the circumstances, there may also be, say, an affidavit of foreign law if for instance, the person is domiciled overseas, and other sort of supporting affidavits in particular circumstances.
Yeah, and talk about, at least in my business and in the situations that I've worked through where there's been kind of multifamily wealth, there's been multifamily after somebody dies, who gets named. I think a lot of people get very stressed out about being named as the responsible party there, especially if they're not kind of doing this every day or they're not even familiar with the country that they're in. Is there any specialized knowledge that people kind of need to know, or do they need to immediately reach out to their attorney and feel like they would be better equipped to handle some of these things?
I mean, there is the probate process to be gone through, and almost inevitably people will need a lawyer to assist them with that process. And I'm not just saying that to drum up business. And then inevitably, they may well need guidance on, right, okay, well, how do I interpret this will? Who gets what? What are my responsibilities as an executor? And, then there will be obviously the process of transferring assets, doing transmitting the shares to somebody else, or maybe applying for any real estate to be registered in the name of the executors so they can sell it, or whatever it may be. There's all that sort of process to be got through, and then kind of at the end of the process, there'll be an inventory to be filed, which lists all the assets, and ultimately an affidavit of general accounting, which sets out how the estate has been dealt with. So it is probably a process that most people would need guidance on.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think it's also fair to say that the more organized someone is in terms of their estate planning documents, that the cheaper their probate process will be.
Yes, I mean, inevitably, lawyers tend to charge on a time basis.
I've noticed that about you guys.
So the more helpful that the client can be, inevitably the lower the cost.
Yeah. Well, one more question before we take a break. What about if someone dies in debt? I know a lot of times we talk about assets, but what if somebody doesn't have any assets and they only have debts? What happens then?
Well, then effectively the estate is insolvent. You can't just inherit the assets and ignore the debts, put it that way. So they don't just go away, unfortunately.
So any assets that would exist would automatically be used to pay the debts before
the responsibility of the executor would be to part of their responsibilities is indeed to liquidate assets and pay any debts.
All right. Well, we're going to take a quick 1-minute break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Andrew Miller talking about death.
The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you. Please be advised that the pension contribution holiday has been extended until 31st of March, 2022. Employers and plan members should ensure arrangements are in place for salary deductions and remittance following this date. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, keeping you informed. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky. And for information as it happens, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Email admin@pensions.ky or call 745-7630. We're here for you.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
All right, welcome back to Money Sense. We are still with Andrew Miller of Beto Kristen talking about estate planning, probate, and all the things that you need to be preparing for what will ultimately happen to us all, death. And in the first half of the show, we talked a lot about kind of probates and wills and just kind of what happens if you were to die. But what about other documents in terms of estate planning that you're really going to need? I know a lot of times we're only planning for death, but I think a lot of times estate planning can also be planning for disability in those cases. And what kind of documents do you also kind of need to have on within your estate planning document, within your estate plan, to kind of plan for any eventuality, and especially unexpected death or disability?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are kind of two sides to that. There's the mental incapacity side, and also the sort of more medical side. So if, for example, somebody has thoughts about if they became in a vegetative state and they're not likely to recover, some people have thoughts about what they would like to happen in those sort of circumstances. And if people do have wishes in that respect, then they can be included in what's called an advance directive. And that's essentially a direction to doctors and the family about how they would like to be treated in those circumstances. So that's one document that people might like to think about.
Is that the same as a DNR, a do not resuscitate order, or is that in addition?
Yeah, that sort of thing. The other thing that one needs to think about is powers of attorney. And at the moment, the position in the Cayman Islands is that we don't have what are termed enduring powers of attorney. So if someone gives for instance, a spouse a power of attorney, that's only valid as long as they have capacity. We do have moves afoot in the Cayman Islands, hopefully, to bring in enduring powers of attorney, because they can, of course, be very useful in circumstances where, for instance, you have a husband and wife and the husband becomes incapacitated and there are funds in a bank account and, those funds are, for instance, needed for his medical care. So, I mean, that's certainly something that hopefully will come to pass in the future.
Yeah, you would almost think that would be the default, that there would be durability to a power of attorney.
Regrettably not at the moment.
Or even some sort of kind of having a doctor certify that this person is incapacitated.
Yeah, a doctor will certify that they're incapacitated. The problem is that at the moment that will mean that
the power of attorney no longer is good.
That revokes any powers of attorney that they have.
I didn't know that. I learned something today. And then power of attorney, of course, ends at death. I get that question a lot. It's like, oh, no, I'm power of attorney. I said, well, that power of attorney is
yes.
no longer valid today.
Yes, death is the ultimate revocation of a power of attorney. You're right.
Well, what about trusts? I know a lot of people, at least from my perspective, I encourage trust a lot in my career, and I'm sure that you do as well. But I think a lot of people have it in their mind that trusts are for the ultra rich or very high net worth people, or people that have more complex estates or asset situations. But I find that the trust can be very useful in terms of blended families, in terms of even multi-generational wealth. What's kind of your perspective in terms of the everyman needing a trust?
Yeah, I mean, you are right. In the Cayman Islands being an international financial center, I would say 99% of the trusts that get formed here are for high net worth, ultra high net worth individuals, families, and quite often the assets are overseas, and there's a licensed trust company acting here. And yes, that the costs of setting that up and maintaining it are quite large. Certainly, generally speaking, you're talking about assets of, say, $10-15 million and above, and even that would be at the low level. But you're right, there can be other circumstances where a trust may be suitable for, even moderately wealthy families where, as you rightly say, you may have blended families, so you might want to set up a trust during lifetime to make sure that, children from a first marriage are provided for. There are circumstances where, for instance, you may have a adult child with learning disabilities. You may want to set up a separate trust for them to make sure that they're provided for after the parents are no longer around. So yes, there are circumstances where a trust for your more averagely wealthy person would be suitable.
Yeah, I actually spent my first 10 years at a trust company in my career, and so I learned a lot, and I always have the craziest stories from being administering trust. I had one that a lady had established a trust that would continue to fund the expenses of her cat after she was gone, as well as pay for the cat to be cremated and then put in the mausoleum with her, but only after the cat had ultimately been gone. So people do trust for all sorts of crazy reasons.
So, because of client confidentiality, I can't go into details. But yes, I sometimes think that some of the stuff that I see, if you read it in a Jackie Collins novel, you wouldn't believe it. But it's real life, yes.
Yeah, I could tell some stories too. So we're there. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper into, in the last few minutes here in our show, in terms of our multinational population. I find it even stresses me out a little bit in terms of just having assets in other places. What, I guess, specific things do you need to be thinking about in terms of if you are either married to a person of a different nationality or you yourself have multiple passports? What kind of additional things would you be talking to somebody that comes into your office with kind of some multinational assets, even if they're not large, what kind of
I mean, if somebody comes in and they're clearly multinational, I mean that will usually trigger a conversation, because that is indicative that they may well have assets overseas, and it's the assets overseas element that requires some extra thinking about. I mean, for instance, a lot of the clients I deal with may have properties in 3 or 4 jurisdictions, and if they do nothing else, that means there may be eventually the requirement to make 3 or 4 separate applications for grants of probate, for instance, or grants of letters of administration. Or it may be more complex than that if they come from, for instance, a civil law country that doesn't have laws that are similar to the Cayman Islands. And those may be the sort of circumstances where it may be, again, appropriate to have a trust, and sometimes people will have underlying holding companies. And so all of the assets, if you like, are corralled under the umbrella of a trust. And so actually the death of what is then the settlor of the trust may not have any impact on those assets in the sense of having to apply for a grant of probate.
I guess we didn't talk about that. But a trust, any assets that are owned in a trust would not go to probate either, because a trust doesn't die, right? Anything, if it's owned by a trust, the trust owns it, not the settlor.
That's exactly right, yes.
Well, that's something to think about too. So you're mentioning that some countries are easier than others. So countries obviously that follow English law, or like Australia or New Zealand or the Cayman Islands. What about other countries? Are there other countries that are a little more difficult to deal with in terms of estate administration?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, one would like to think that in most countries that there is a tried and tested process for assets devolving from one generation to the next. That's it's more on the practical side, really. In some countries, the bureaucracy of obtaining some sort of grant is labyrinth-like.
I can imagine, especially if they're owned by a Cayman Islands trust. I can see why some countries would be.
That's precisely where, with a lot of countries, you'd think, right, okay, well, you definitely want to try to avoid that process. So best have the assets, say, held by a trust, or at least, at the very least, some sort of holding company. So what you're actually dealing with would be if you had assets overseas in multiple jurisdictions. If you hold those assets in a Cayman Islands company, then you're actually only applying for one grant of probate, which would be a Cayman Islands grant of probate, because instead of dealing with the underlying assets, you're dealing with the shares of the company.
Right. Yeah, and along those lines, I think when we're talking about investment accounts, investments with different custodians, and I know we don't want to get too deep in the weeds with taxation, but obviously that's not something that we kind of think immediately here, living here, but in terms of having property overseas, are there what kind of mitigating factors when you're talking about having assets overseas that might be subject to tax there, but then being owned here? Yeah,
sure. And I'll as a recovering tax advisor, I'll try and avoid the subject.
I know this
of
is
tax.
probably a week long seminar, but we have 3 minutes left.
But,
so.
A very broad brushstroke.
Right.
A lot of other countries do have inheritance taxes.
Yes.
And a common strategy for avoiding those inheritance taxes is indeed to hold the assets overseas, particularly if they're substantial assets, say a large share portfolio or property or worth substantial amounts. A common strategy will be to hold those under the umbrella of a trust, usually through an underlying holding company, for instance. Mm-hmm. And that holding company may be in the Cayman Islands or it may be overseas.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people even don't necessarily think about in terms of what it could cause for their estate, even if they're not, say, a French citizen, but they own something, have a French bank account or have a French piece of property or something of that nature that could somehow be pulled back into their inheritance laws.
Yes. France is a very
maybe France wasn't a good example because I'm not familiar with their
it's a lovely place to live, I'm sure.
Yes,
but owning assets there, in my experience, can be quite challenging.
All right. Well, we only have about 1 minute left, so give a kind of a final tactic. People are going to be getting together for Christmas. They're going to be maybe talking to their elderly parents, talking to their family that has underage children. What are the main talking points that should be over Christmas dinner?
Yeah. Takeaway being the difficulty is wills tend to be the ultimate back burner project, but really they should be on the front burner because if it's nothing more than making sure that the right person deals with your assets, they go to who you want them to, and that your children have guardians in circumstances that would be very difficult, then that at the very least that basic step needs to be taken.
And can you just write it out a will with a hand holographic, or do you need to hire an attorney?
Generally speaking, and this is again not me drumming up business, you'd probably need a bit of help with that.
Yes. So we assume there are many attorneys on the island willing to do that, including yourself and Bill Kristen.
Yeah, you obviously want to go to a specialized attorney because it is a specialized area of the law. But yes, there's plenty of attorneys out there that can help you.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. Great conversation, Andrew. Thank you so much for being here. As a reminder, a recording of today's recording will be available on the CFA Society Cayman Islands website. And if you have any further topics for communication, please email us at cfasci@gmail.com. With that, we'll see you maybe next year. I'm not sure if we're doing a Christmas show, but we'll keep you updated.
Do you know how well your pension plan performed? The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan provides quarterly fund fact sheets for our members to stay informed with the plan's performance. For the year ended 30th June 2021, the various life cycle funds have provided returns between 8.56% and 36.86%, and our all-in expense ratio is 0.80%. Visit chamberpension.ky to review our fund fact sheets. You can see the performance as far back as 10 years. Remember that pensions are a longer-term investment strategy. Focus on the long term rather than the short-term returns. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan continues to perform for you.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky.